Hi, I'm Adeline Pang, and welcome to Conversations on Change, where we engage in dynamic discussion with guest experts and stay inspired while staying ahead in the world of change. Our topic today is an extremely timely one. What really determines whether strategy succeeds or stalls? More often than not, it's not the plan, but the culture and the leadership choices behind it. Your organizational system either enables or constrains your success. We'll explore how culture becomes a true competitive edge when it is intentionally designed and aligned to strategy, supported by the right structures, decision-making frameworks, and leadership capability. Our guest experts today are two leaders who are just the right people to take on this challenge from complementary angles, Elf Carlesäter and Anish Lalchandani. Anish brings over 25 years of global experience shaping talent, leadership, and culture at enterprise scale. Having partnered closely with CEOs and executive teams across industries, he focuses on translating business strategy into tangible people outcomes, from leadership pipelines and skills-based workforce models to global learning ecosystems. His work is grounded in a core belief. Culture only drives performance when leadership, systems, and behaviors are aligned. Hi, Anish. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adeline, for having me. Really excited for this conversation.
Elf is the founder of Grow HR Consulting and a senior HR leader with more than 2 decades of experience across APAC and EMEA. He has held leadership roles with General Electric, Meta, Braze, and Goldman Sachs, helping organizations navigate growth, transformation, governance, and people risk. Today, he advises founders, CEOs, and leadership teams on how to scale effectively without losing clarity, accountability, or culture. Hello, Alf. It's good to see you here with us.
Thank you very much, Adeline. I appreciate being here.
Appreciate your time being here with us as well. Firstly, let's frame the conversation. When we talk about using culture as a competitive advantage, what does it actually mean in practice and not just a concept? Perhaps, Alf, you would like to take this question first.
Yeah, no, sure. Thank you. I think a simple way of putting it is that a culture is an operating system and strategy sort of runs on top of it. What I think that means in practice is that when the culture is right, people are making better decisions without needing to escalate everything. The accountability is sort of spread organically across the organization rather than sitting with two or three people at the top. And then when something unexpected hits, it can be a market shift, a leadership change, what have you, the organization responds in a way that is more comfortable and more sort of organic rather than to freeze and be paralyzed. So I've seen this at various organizations that performed consistently, even if they didn't have the sharpest strategy. Just that enablement of having a strong culture that is action oriented helps you to unlock. So the culture carries that ability, not in itself a strategy document. So that I think is the importance of culture.
Thanks so much for putting that into context, Alf. I like that how you said it's like an operating system, so it's like a way of life rather than just a strategy document, like it's a live thing, an active thing. And I saw that Anish, you were nodding along, so really curious to know your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think, building further on what Alf said, for me, I think when I look at culture becoming the competitive advantage, I think essentially it's like we start seeing that in every day how decisions are being made. Yeah, you see that translated there. And that's something, it's not like a product or a service or pricing which a competitor can easily copy. So that is where it becomes more competitive advantage when it creates value, which is disproportionate compared to your competitors. Uh, it kind of helps you to win in the marketplace, not only by your products but by a way of designing things. Say, Apple comes to mind, so innovation culture, if you look at it. And it is rare. So yes, every organization would have a culture. good or bad, depending on how they look at it. But what makes them competitive is that's not replicable across. So you can have an innovative culture, but you may not be able to have it as good as Apple, possibly. Yeah, but there are also parts of the culture in Apple which people don't like. So it's quite an interesting combination, but I think where it really drives value is, where it hits the customer in terms of how things come together. So some part of it, what I've said, is operating system, ways of working, decision making, and that is where I guess it becomes really competitive advantage. Otherwise, I think everyone has a culture, I would say, but some organizations make it look very different and feel very different for their employees as well as customers.
I love that. I love how you've really nailed it. It's just very specific and very unique and making what specifically works for you. Um, Thanks so much for putting it into context. So I was also curious because now we're talking about competitive edge, but at what point does culture actually start to become a business risk rather than just, a topic for human resources, an HR topic?
For me, again, I look at culture as always a business risk. It is always a risk. I think we should actually take that way of thinking, that if we don't cultivate it, if we don't manage it, if we don't role model it, it will become an issue. Otherwise, it's always a risk, and I think we need to manage it accordingly. It's my past is in banking, as Alf did, so I think it was a kind of culture around, how do you manage your risk? So if you ask me, I think I'd always see that as a risk because, as they say, culture eats strategy for breakfast, which is so true. Because if that is your risk, then your business strategy also is going to get impacted. And we have many examples we have seen, this happening. One definitely is from banking, from Wells Fargo. They were fined, I don't know, billions of dollars. There were malpractices in terms of how accounts were opened. There was a pressure on sales incentives, on targets. And that is where, if you ask me, it became an issue. Yeah, and there are many other examples as well, but that's not something only HR can kind of manage. If you ask me, HR plays a very, very important role, but at the same time, it is a way of doing business in many ways. So aspects around risk, conduct, ethics, safety, inclusion, accountability, all of those, if you ask me, in different ways can shape this, and how do you manage the risk and how do you win in the marketplace, or it becomes an issue like Wells Fargo and many other companies have faced that as well. So yeah, I think it's a tough one in many ways, but there are also ways how we can really cultivate the right culture for the organization where we want to really kind of progress.
I love how I asked at what point does it become a risk? And your answer is at every point it is a risk. We have to consider how to deal with it in the right ways. Thanks for that. How about you, Alf? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this topic.
Yeah, no, great. And I think, Anish, you sort of hit the nail on the head there as well with the examples you mentioned. And I can bring up very similar examples from GE, where GE Money Bank was likewise fined for decisions that were not the best decisions. Let's just call it that without getting into detail. But for me, I think the signal of when the decision quality starts to degrade is when the risk is sort of in your face. Like, how do you actually make those decisions? How do you end up making those bad decisions? Uh, when you're looking back in hindsight, and how do you catch it up front proactively? So I think when you realize that the decision quality is starting to degrade, you're not making the decisions that are actually best for the team, for the individual, for the organization, for the customers. That's the moment when it goes away from being a HR frame topic to kind of cutting across the organization as a business risk. And perhaps to give you an example, right? I've seen organizations that have scaled very fast, right? They've scaled across several markets. Revenue is up, headcount is up, everything looks hunky dory on paper, right? But then when you started looking at how decisions were actually made, then you realize that there is no particular authorization or delegation or accountability lower down. It all bubbles up to a central few points or few couple of people, right? And I think there's a risk when the middle leaders are stopping to decide, stopping to influence. They're not getting engaged and involved in what actually drives good cultural behavior that manages risk. So that exposure, I think, is also organizational, but also personal, right? People stop taking decisions that they actually should own. So accountability it becomes an issue, and so that is a culture problem. But it's also an execution problem. It's a governance problem, right? Because the HR framing of culture tends to focus on values and engagement, which of course is super important, right? If you're speaking from a HR perspective, right, to build a team, so that's not wrong in itself, right? But it misses an operational dimension. So you need to look at culture in terms of decision patterns and not just employee engagement survey scores.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree. And there's so much that resonates there. I think even with Anish's answer, everything is very interconnected, isn't it? And actually it leads me to my next question. Um, so from your experience, then what are the early signals when an organization's culture is actually no longer aligned with its strategy? Because we were talking about the interconnectedness of how everything needs to be.
So looking at the misalignment, right, between culture and strategy, I think it's a matter of trying to identify the gap between what is stated and what is an actual observable reality. Um, so organizations will declare, tell you, put on the wall what the values are. But if you watch how they spend their time, what they are putting money towards, how they are budgeting, what gets rewarded, what kind of behavior is accepted, what perhaps even gets tolerated, you may have a different picture emerging from, the fancy key principles or guiding principles of the organization. So, so that's one aspect of it, right? The other aspect, I think, is if you look at escalations, what escalates? If everything is kind of ending up on the same couple of senior people's desks, then that tells you something about the level of accountability that permeates the organization. What kind of accountability architecture are you implementing in your organization? Is it very centralized? Is it decentralized? And I think also if you look at strong performers, if they are starting to leave and you can't really put your finger on it, it may be a bit of a washed out, exit interview statement around, I don't feel like things were moving, or I stopped feeling like I had real impact. That could be linked as well to some sort of sense of, you could call it culture fatigue. Like there's a dissonance between what you say we are going to do and what the actual lived and felt reality is. And I think that's friction that people feel before they can even label it. So I think those are signals of what may signify a gap between what the culture is meant to be and what it actually is felt like.
Absolutely. I think it's more of what is actually lived and, like you said, practiced rather than what's on paper. Um, even speaking for myself as a runner, when I go running, it's so easy to get bogged down by the numbers. But then when I listen to guided podcasts on running, they talk about how you go by not your speed or your pace or even your heart rate, but how you're feeling to go by whether the run is working in the way that you want it to. And absolutely resonated with that, Alf. So thanks for
Yeah.
that. So uh, Anish, firstly, anything else to add to this
I think,
question?
I'll touch upon. I think decision making is where you start sensing what's going on. Is it taking too much time? Is it always going up? So I think that's, from a business point of view, a very, very strong signal, in my view. The other one, I think, I've also seen this and possibly experienced it as well, is people start to talk in the past tense. We used to have a culture which was agile, like a startup. Yeah. So like there was a culture, but I think, there are now challenges and issues. They don't see it and experience it now and today. So possibly there's a very rich history, yeah, and really a great culture and strategy, but things start to change and people start to say, oh, it used to be like that. And to me, I think that's a big signal for you, to kind of sense that and understand why is it really happening. And again, I guess from an exit point of view, or I think I always call this one out, is onboarding. If onboarding starts to fail the smell test in terms of what we told people when they were being hired, that this is how the culture is, all of that stuff, and after 30, 60, 90 days, you ask them, and they give you a different picture, that this is what I heard, this is what I see. That itself can be alarming as well. I think that's also the reason there are some mechanisms where a lot of people, organizations specifically, look at onboarding, look at exits. But to me, those are kind of, really systematic touch points. But we need to have a continuous listening approach, which helps us to understand and get these signals early on. And of course, a lot of it depends also on business and leaders. But I think that's where a lot of opportunities lie in how do you really assess and kind of, do any required interventions as the need may be. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Anish. I totally agree about that listening part of it, and it fits in really nicely with what Alf was saying as well, in terms of it's a live thing, right? And what we've been saying actually the whole time, it's a live thing. It's not an on paper thing. And so of course, if it's something that is alive, we need to always be listening, actively listening, and so then those touch points that you're talking about really, really come into play and are really, really important. So now we're talking about life, right? It's a living thing, it's a real thing. So how do we make it work for us in real life? How do we make that integration of strategy and culture work for us in real life? Anish, you were talking about Apple as an aspirational organizational culture that seems to make it work for strategy as well. So how would you advise translating culture from something aspirational like Apple into something that actually also drives execution and performance? We've mentioned a couple of names before, but would you have any other examples or case studies to share with us?
Sure. I guess the first thing is, it's all about, it shouldn't be a values exercise and communication exercise alone. That's not gonna, I think it's great for engagement, I'll be very honest, but that's not gonna really drive performance. That's the way I see it. It means culture will be able to drive performance when you actually start really seeing how values are actually, start becoming behaviors. Yeah. People start to really see that. And when actually behaviors start to become like, very, very systematic approach to it. So you start seeing systems arising out of that. And when you start seeing systems, you then see really that driving the right decisions which are required. Yeah. And again, there are different cultures, like from innovation, possibly Apple would be one of those. But if you look at it from, say, customer centricity point of view, Amazon does a lot of work in terms of, and this is something how they make it very, very practical to say is they actually make it into rituals. Yeah. So they have values, they have the leadership expectations, but they actually translate that into how do you run business. And we follow some of that as well in terms of, literally writing a press release for a product at the design stage. Yeah. What does that mean is that when you're actually starting to even design something, you say, this is how I will launch it, and this is my press release, how it will look like. And we write PR FAQs behind it to say, this is who the customer is, how do we approach it, how do we go behind it. And they bed that down in a process which directly impacts their performance, their customer, their revenue. Yeah. So if you start looking at that, yes, values, leadership expectations, but then it actually starts getting into the day-to-day of how decisions are made. And this is just one example. There are many others, but I guess The main thing is how do you start to kind of look at decisions that are helping you, decisions that are helping you to fulfill the customer promise, the stakeholder promises, and helping you to kind of be really doing all the right work from a community point of view as well. So it tries to kind of connect overall ecosystem of stakeholders, but it definitely kind of starts to then look at how does it impact business performance. And of course, I think the most underrated way of making it practical is stories. A lot of people use stories and narratives, but then how do you do it in a manner which is not in your face, but it's real and what people say actually what they feel rather than it's scripted. But that is where a number of organizations, when they start to focus heavily on their culture, they use that as a kind of a way to kind of make it practical and easy and relatable to people as well. But of course, there are a number of other ways you can always approach this as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm actually noticing a little bit of a through line in this. Where we were talking about active listening and even using very, very smartly using stories to bring that relatability. And I think at the core of it is really authenticity, right? It's not just about what is happening on paper and in strategy, but it's the active listening, the checking in, the touch points, the relatability, all brings it down to a point of authenticity. It has to be real. Alf, anything to add on this?
Well, let's see. I think Anish really covered a lot, so I don't know whether there is to add of value per se. I agree with everything, right? I think the trick really is to operationalize it. How do you make that culture actually lived? And what works, I think, in practice is when you are anchoring the culture in actual accountabilities. We want you to display this behavior, act in a certain way, and we recognize that, and then you will be rewarded accordingly, or otherwise told to, adjust, right? So it's not a value statement. It's not a piece of paper. It's actual clarity on who owns what, at what level, what kind of authority. So when that exists, I think the cultural norms are really stopping to be abstract and they are part of what you do. They become part of the DNA, they're part of how you operate in your team, in your function across the organization. So getting that embedded in how work gets done day to day is kind of the trick. How you translate that aspiration into something real. And then the culture does become something that people actually live rather than something that leadership communicates, right? It's all about what behavior is being actually demonstrated. You can talk until the cows come home about what your aspirations are and put all the posters on the wall and what have you. But it's a little bit like raising kids, right? Don't do what do what I say, don't do what I do. But the kids will gravitate towards doing what you do. And that's, I think, deep-rooted human psychology. You have to demonstrate the right behavior. So that becomes kind of a common responsibility that has to permeate the entire organization. So lived rather than something communicated.
I really love that saying that it simplifies everything, but in such a good way, such a clear way, as you say. It's good to have clarity. Um, so we've talked about living rather than just communicating and show rather than tell. So what are some practical ways that leaders can diagnose whether culture is truly enabling strategy or quietly blocking it? If a leadership team could focus on just one or two levers to shift culture in a meaningful way, what would they be? What's your advice on that?
So I think it's a great question, Adeline, and we've talked about a number of different levers or ways you can approach it. Yeah, but one I think practical thing which I did a number of years ago in my previous organization was, and we went through an entire really like a cycle of we had our strategy refresh, we changed our values to value behaviors in the organization, which was done bottom up from 70,000 odd colleagues. We heard from them what they think is valued. And then I guess it was a specific point in time for us to think of how do we approach this? How do we take it forward? Of course, it was launched, number of things were done. But one of the things which I was asked from my CPO to look at was around managers and leaders. And the way we approached this was managers are actually culture carriers. And how do we actually help our managers to take on this journey and it becomes more experienced at each and every team level? It doesn't remain a HR thing, so to say. Yeah. And how do we kind of make sure we support our managers? And one of the key things what we did was really framing this differently to say is all of you are leaders, not managers. And there's a huge focus on even shifting that narrative. But then instead of doing the very, very traditional approach of, okay, let's train them, let's upskill them, which we already had programs for, we thought about what will help them to execute the people practices and other aspects which are required and just make sure it's there. But how do we make sure we work with this community of leaders? And that time, I think it was around 15,000 leaders for that organization. And we created a very, very different approach to how do we look at people leadership effectiveness, which helps drive our culture. And how do we, like, even from a marketing point of view, start to look at who's my audience? We actually said, if leaders are our audience, do we really speak to them regularly? Do we really speak to them consistently? And we started some big calls with our CEOs, with our leaders. We started communities. We started looking at how would we hire, and how do we groom them and how do we support them. And one of the things I think we also kind of looked interestingly, because we all love to measure things, to say is, would you recommend your manager to other colleagues? Like a manager NPS. This is something was done in Project Oxygen in Google. And we shamelessly copied because we thought it's a great way when we are really defining what great leadership looks like, we should measure it. And coming back to it means this starts to kind of help you to look at, we could have purely done leadership development, the basic stuff, but we took a very, very bespoke and different approach. And that helped us to unblock number of things because we started to kind of not only change the kind of behaviors we expect from leaders, but they are then role modeling the behaviors we are kind of, proposing. They are kind of creating their own cultures in many ways because you can't dictate stuff. So they start to create own culture, but directionally in the same manner. But this is one example, I would say, where we kind of attempted it very differently. And I think, after a couple of years, we actually saw the manager NPS numbers moving drastically as well. That's one indication. But as I think, we talked about, it's not always about what you do, but how do you make people feel? How do they kind of respond to it? All of that also matters. But hopefully this helps as an example.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So pretty much it's all about perspective, right? As you said, framing the perspective. Just a reframing of perspective does so much already. Alf, anything to add on this?
Yeah, but listen, I think it's absolutely correct to pinpoint the right questions to ask. Similar to Google's Project Oxygen, right? Would you recommend your manager? That's a powerful question, right? It holds a lot, right? If you want to analyze that. So I think for diagnosis is really, from my perspective, more around looking at decision, hierarchy and behavior rather than, a survey, a cultural survey, right? So I think a couple of questions are useful in trying to understand whether it is enabling or a blocking strategy, as a question was phrased, right? And number one, I keep coming back to it, but it's kind of a central theme throughout what we are discussing as well. But where are decisions getting stuck? What is it, right? Is it because it goes up to the same people at the higher level? Is it because people in the middle don't feel empowered? It kind of just floats around for too long. Where is it? Where does the decision get stuck? So that's a good question. Another one, which I think is critical as well, is around behavior, right? What behavior is being rewarded that probably shouldn't be rewarded, right? So one of those diagnostics that I've done with my clients recently is to ask them these questions and have a very open discussion around what people actually feel and think, right? And then thirdly, around leadership, right? What leadership is modeling that contradicts what it is asking of others. Again, it comes back to what I mentioned around look at what I do or listen to what I say. Which one is it, right? So you have to drive consistency, right? So just these couple of key questions, I think, is going to unlock a bit around the reality of the organization and hopefully throw up a few things that creates aha moments, right? Whether that's with senior leadership or middle managers, yeah? Just that reflective little bit of soul searching, perhaps organizational soul searching that just makes you go, maybe actually we are allowing more than we should, and maybe we aren't fully demonstrating the culture that we would like to have around here. So key questions, I think, is going to help you diagnose.
Anish and Elf, you have both had extensive experience working with leaders and leadership teams across the globe. So, what advice do you have when it comes to balancing global consistency with local cultural nuance, especially across regions and markets?
Is I think if you look at this and depending on how organizations are set up, yeah, from SMEs to regional to global to matrix, and at times it becomes very complicated. Yeah, but what we I think we do need to realize is one thing which stays constant or possibly global in nature are things around values that kind of becomes non-negotiable because you can't expect each area or region to have their own set of values. Yeah. So values, ethics, safety, those aspects, if you ask me, remain non-negotiable, basic standard, have to be done in many ways. When I say have to be done, is not necessarily for values because what people would understand as values and practice it, that's where nuances and local aspects would come in. So you can have standard values, but the way they are practiced, the way they are kind of adapted to local context is where it becomes real. Because if you say this is how we look at inclusion and compared to what's in the US to what's in say Korea or other parts of Asia would be totally different. But inclusion would possibly remain as a key theme, I would say. So that is where I guess we also need to look at like leaders being culture carriers. They are able to adapt that to the local aspects. They're able to bring stories which are local in nature. And that's how you start to balance, says we have a consistent narrative around our values, but then how they are practiced, how they are lived is where it actually becomes local. If you even just look at uh, DBS, yeah, one of our regional banks here. Now, it's an Asian bank, if I call it, but they have gone so much and done so much in the digital space. They're kind of looking at a global tech firm, but they're kind of bringing both those aspects together when they're keeping it. Yeah, so they don't want to be a global tech or digital bank. They want to be kind of an Asian bank which is digital. Yeah, so that's how you start to bring things together. But as it goes, even within, I'm sure DBS, when it translates values in their Taiwan branch would be different than Singapore, but their values possibly remain consistent and standard, I would say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a classic what and how discussion, right? I've always said I want to be relatively prescriptive around the what, how you get to there. You have to figure out your own way, right? So I mean, my career is spent a lot across GE and Meta, operating across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, parts of Europe. And I think in terms of the balance between local and global, HQ and region, many organizations get it wrong. I'm not pointing out the organization I just mentioned, but I'm just saying in general, and I have other examples as well, where this kind of east-west imbalance is quite palpable, right? And in terms of getting the balance wrong, it tends to be, and maybe I'm biased, but it tends to be in one direction more than the other, right? Um, so I think if you are trying to export a headquarter culture wholesale, what tends to happen or what is produced in that is a compliance rather than a commitment. people learn to perform the right behaviors without necessarily internalizing it, right? Again, I'm going to come back as a father, right? I like to do examples around fatherhood, right? But it's very easy for you to get compliance. You just go a little bit big and authoritative, and your kids will fall in line, right? Are they going to fully understand, or are they just going to act accordingly because you have instructed them? I'd apply the same thing myself in actual real life situation in business, where the non-negotiables, as again Anish mentioned correctly, are really truly non-negotiable. The things that are going to land you in jail or create that unwanted headline, non-negotiable. So I think it's really important to find that balance, right, around being tight on what is non-negotiable, so the governance standards, your ethical behavior, even decision authority, I would argue, right? And then genuinely loose on how those things are expressed locally. Because a performance conversation that you have with a team or an individual in Singapore looks different from one that you have in Stockholm. It's just the nature of the culture difference, right? And that is fine, right? But what matters is that both happen, that both are honest, and that actually produce some sort of outcome, right? So the what is there, standard. How you create a bit of flex, right? Uh, what you can't decree, I think, in terms of local adaptation, is to have that mandated from the center. It really does require a leader in the region, in a regional role, to have the mandate and to have the capability to actually navigate that space, that balance between East and West, local and HQ. And I think building that takes investment. It takes investment in nurturing those relationships. It takes time, right? But the intention, I think, has to be there from my perspective around determining the what, leaving the how, with a good measure of flex.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. And I think it is so true. There are some non-negotiables, and even that cultural aspect of the leader bringing that story, like Anish said, that is also a non-negotiable, I would say. I would like to end now with a question that is focused on the future. If culture is truly our competitive edge, what do you advise is the one thing that leaders should stop doing and the one thing that they should start doing today to make that happen, to make that real?
So I'm trying to think of one because I'm a maximizer and I always look at, oh, leaders and others, they should be doing so many things. So if I really have to look at one thing they should stop doing, I would say to start kind of seeing culture as a HR initiative. Yeah. Because I think it's not going to be helpful. And a lot many times either think, oh, this is a culture thing, this is something HR should do. Yeah. So I think that is where I guess the perception, the understanding, the ownership, I think that should shift drastically in my view. And maybe if we think of what they should start doing, I would think for the clear ask from my point of view would be how can you put words into actions? Yeah, which is the thing. If the words are the values, then how do you really put them into action and decisions, what we talked about? And how do you own it? Because it's also about leading through that. So possibly that's something I would say is one thing I would expect leaders in business to do, start doing a lot more.
Thanks for that. And it's very consistent to what you've been saying. So you've managed to distill it very well.
I
Uh,
tried my best.
it worked. How about you, Alf? If you can distill it into one thing they should start and one thing they should stop.
Yeah, on the stopping side of the equation, I think stop treating culture as a communications exercise. It doesn't change because you send a better all hands message or you refresh your values on the intranet. It changes when the structures and the incentives change. What are you actually rewarding? So stop announcing things and start designing things. On the starting things, I think if you start treating culture as an operational variable, not as a background condition, you're moving in the right direction. It has to be included, I think, explicitly when you are assessing risk. I mentioned performance evaluation. What are you allowing? What are you not allowing? So that becomes a part of it, and making structural decisions. So I think when culture actually becomes a design choice and not something that just happens, it's not left to chance. It's very deliberate. And that's when it actually starts working for you.
I love that piece of advice. Thank you so much. And again, really true to what you've been answering throughout the conversation as well. So thanks for that. I enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Thank you. I
Uh,
think it was great. Yeah, and it was really, I would say, natural and free flowing rather than very, very scripted, I would say. Otherwise, it feels like that. So it was a great conversation. Yeah, and great to hear your insights as well, Alf. Yeah.
yeah, no, likewise, Anish, and we should meet up in real life as well.
I think what really stands out from our conversation today is that culture isn't something that is separate from strategy. It is actually how strategy gets executed. Culture shows up in how decisions are made, how leaders lead, and how organizations are designed to perform under pressure. And that's where the real competitive edge lies. A big thank you to both Anish and Elf for such a thoughtful and grounded conversation. Thanks for really unpacking what it takes to move the concept of culture into something that genuinely drives strategy and performance. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Until the next Conversations on Change, stay inspired and intentional.